I would be remiss if I didn't bring up some songwriting, just how you do it. One lyric I want to quote from Ray Wally Hubbard. He says, "You got to have scars if you want to be a poet." And so I definitely feel that, like in your music. Like you're very young, but I feel like have an old soul just listening to your music, like you've been living or you've been through some shit, you know. And so I'm curious to know, what's the process like? And I know that's a generic question you probably get a lot. And another quote I saw, you said, "Manual labor frees up my mind to write and let the ideas flow." So I'm sure these ideas come to you, but I'm just curious to know, like, how does that process start from song to song or album to album? Like, do you have a theme that you're going with for each album?
Song to song is a little tricky because for me, and I know some people that are great songwriters and they have a very specific kind of by the book, step by step songwriting process, and it works for them.
Yeah.
But I've never really been that guy for songs. I've tried to do that sort of thing and figure out some sort of template, I guess, for writing songs, but it's never really worked for me doing that. So it's kind of what I usually tell people is it's really different every time for me. Sometimes and there's variables and constants, but it's a little different every time. Sometimes it might be a turn of phrase or a line that I've come up with or I heard somebody say, I wrote it down somewhere and forgot about it, found it later. That kind of sparks it. That's that initial inspiration,
Right.
And then other times it's completely different where the music maybe comes first as opposed to, the story or a certain turn of phrase. Sometimes it's just sitting around picking something out on the guitar and you get maybe a melody kind of in your head or a certain progression that's just a little bit different and or you're stealing from some other song and you don't know it, you're just kind of picking along, and then that turns into something completely different and it becomes its own song.
Yeah.
So it's kind of different a little bit every time. One of the variables for me, or one of the constants for me when it comes to writing, is my favorite ones that I've written are usually ones where I feel like I've had the least amount to do with the writing of it, where it just sort of feels like, and it's cliche and people talk about this a lot, I'm sure, but it feels like it just sort of falls out of the sky,
Yeah.
and those are usually, I think those turn out the best because they just feel like something completely, it's almost supernatural, where they just sort of, you can't move the pen fast enough or whatever to keep up with these thoughts that are just sort of falling out of the sky into your head. That's one thing that is always kind of the same when it does happen like that, is I usually know that it's going to be pretty good. And the other thing is just staying busy, which has been something that has been a little tougher to do here with everything going on and not having any shows and anything like that. But staying busy and just doing something to get away from, because I've been guilty too of sitting down and trying to force a song, and you can't do that. It's just like anything in art. It's maybe some people can, but I certainly can't. I usually come up with it's never that great. So you mentioned, manual labor, anything that kind of frees your mind because you're just right there with whatever it is you happen to be doing.
Yeah.
That really good for me and my creative process. I find that usually it just frees up whatever the headspace is that whatever part of my brain, I guess, that the songs come from. It kind of opens that up a little bit, or it's like if I'm really not thinking about it, I'll have some of my best ideas. But if I start to think about it, it's not going to turn out, which
Yeah.
sounds like nonsense, I'm sure, but it feels that way sometimes.
Right. So I'm gonna lean on you for advice. Like, so I bang around on the guitar. I know some cowboy chords, right? GCD, some basic shit. But
All you need, man.
if I'm gonna write a song, like I like to write. Like I journal a lot and I write other stuff. But I wanna start writing some songs. Just amateur, just playing around. What advice does Colter Wall have for me if I want to sit down and go write songs?
The history of songs, especially in North America, and this is something I get kind of nerdy about because I really, really love my history. And I hope that's evident in some of the records and songs I've put out. But
Oh yeah, hell
the
yeah.
history of where music comes from in this part of the world is really the story of the oral traditions of music and folk music, where it all comes from and how it's been passed down over time, and basically what's happened is it used to be that if you were a songwriter or singer or anything like that back in the day, you were expected to steal from other people. You were expected to know these old folk songs and these old standards, whether they came from Ireland or whether they came from, wherever they happened to come from. You were expected to know that and the origin of them and the melodies, and you were expected to have that show up in your compositions, and I'm kind of a student of that in that, I'll be everything's really been done, which people don't like to hear that, but the history of music will tell you that there's so many songs that have in folk music, they're called floating verses or stuff like that, where it'll be the same verse from one folk song shows up in another. So different things like that, or it could be the same thing with melodies. So what I tell people usually is just steal from the right people. Figure out what it is about, everyone their own, what they like in music and the kind of songs they write, like the artists, their favorite artists. Figure out what it is about that songwriter or that artist that really hits you and why you love them so much. And once you kind of get into that, you can figure out who they stole from. Yeah. And it all is sort of this, vicious cycle of and I say steal, which makes it sound dirty, but that really is the history of music in North America, and everything comes from somewhere else, so I've got a lot of stuff like that. You mentioned Steve Earle at the beginning of this. He let me open up for him a couple of times at some shows, and I was just sitting around backstage, and he came in. We were kind of talking. Steve likes to talk. He's a chatty guy, and I'm usually a little more reserved, but I was wanting to appease Steve Earle. Yeah. So we were in a conversation, and he brought up a song I wrote, which is, I've been lucky to get some placement stuff that's kind of brought some popularity to it, called Sleeping on the Blacktop. It's one of the first songs I ever wrote. Yeah. And he looked at me and he was like, so that Blacktop song? I said, yeah. He goes, that's doing pretty good for you. I said, yeah, it's been all right. And he goes, Keith Sykes, Country Morning Music. And there's the refrain in this Keith Sykes song he's talking about goes, hey, darling. And then it's a major thing. It doesn't quite sound the same, but the way he says it, I totally ripped off and put it in my song. The only guy to catch it that I've talked to. He's the only guy that ever pointed out, and he's like, oh, man. And I thought he was going to give me a hard time about it. He goes, I love that, man. I love Keith Sykes. I love that song. And you did a great job of making that your own thing and putting it in a different context. And that was a pretty cool moment for me, just to see that he picked up on that, where, it's an obscure song and everything. And he kind of picked up on it. But that's just goes to show, so that's what I tell anybody if they ask about, trying to write or even just trying to throw stuff together on guitar. Know who your influences are and why you love them, and then make sure if those are the people you love, you better go ahead and just steal from the right folks, and you'll be well on your way. And obviously find a way to make it your own. But I guess it all comes back to know your music and know where everything comes from, and you'll be you're off to a good start, I guess, if you're doing that.
Sage advice. Are you writing those songs like on with pen and paper, or are you typing them up on a computer?
If I have sometimes I'll keep a little booklet kind of or a sketch pad or something around, and if I have pen and paper, I prefer to do that so I can have something physical to hold. But sometimes that's not an option, so sometimes it'll end up just being a notes section of my phone or something like that, or the back of a receipt or whatever happens to be around. Yeah,
that's awesome. Tell me this. Who is Kate McKinnon?
I've had a few people ask about this because, it's an entirely fictional song. And it I guess kind of ties into what I was just rambling on about as far as knowing where songs come from. I wanted to write a murder ballad in the same strain as these traditional murder ballads. There's a lot of them out there in the world of folk music, and a lot of them have similar themes. It seems like there's always like a river or some kind of body of water that's involved. Yeah. And it's usually some kind of lovelorn thing or has to do with a romantic relationship of some kind, more often than not in these old songs. So basically, when I wrote that, I was kind of trying to piggyback off a lot of that stuff and kind of try my own hand at doing a traditional murder ballad. And a lot of those come from Scotch-Irish background, as so much of music that we know as American folk music comes from, a combination of Scotch-Irish and African and a kind of a melting pot. But a lot of those old songs are from Ireland. And I was trying to come up with an Irish name for this girl. Like what's something that just sounds Irish? So it really, I probably didn't put much thought into it at all. And so Kate McCannon, that sounds good. That'll work good in there. I kind of just threw it in the song and never thought about it again. And I don't know if it was one of those subconscious things, but I played that song for somebody, and I wrote that. It feels like a long time ago. It wasn't too long, but a few years back. And I played it for a friend of mine, and they asked me. They said, "Did you say McKinnon or McCannon?" And I said McCannon. They said, "Good, because Kate McKinnon is a comedian on Saturday Night Live." So I kind of cut it pretty close there.
Yeah.
I had a few jokes about that, but it really just came about. I was trying to come up with a name that sounded distinctly Scotch-Irish, to throw in this my take on a murder ballad, and that's where it came from. Yeah. But yeah,